I am going to actually introduce our moderator for the day, Angela Tran. Angela is a general partner at Version 1 Ventures, investing in founders who are building companies that leverage network effects created through connecting people and data. Prior to becoming a VC, Angela co-founded Insight Data Science, an education startup that helps PhD grads transition from academia to careers in data science. Angela is a C100 charter member, and she also just recently joined our board. She is from Toronto, has a BA, Master's, and PhD from the University of Toronto, and she's based here in the Bay Area. Angela, I want to thank you so much for contributing to today's conversation and discussion, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Megan. I guess I don't really have to introduce myself now, but it's such a pleasure for me to be here today to have a fun conversation with Lexi and Sheldon, who I'll introduce shortly. For those of you who came from the previous session with my partner, Boris Wirtz, we promise this is a C100 event, even though you're getting a double dose of version 1 right now. So moving over to Lexi, she is an experienced entrepreneur, an X36 alum, as well as a grad at Queen's in chemical engineering. She's currently the co-founder and CPO of conversationHEALTH. Sheldon is a startup veteran. He founded Infusion Development as its CTO and grew the company to 700 before it was acquired. He's a Singularity U alum, as well as a grad of the University of Waterloo, where he studied computer engineering, as well as U of T, where he studied theology. He's currently the co-founder and CEO of Darwin AI. So I'm going to pass the mic over to each of them so that they can provide more details of their background and their companies. But also in the spirit of Canada, since I miss home so much, I currently live in the Bay Area and have not been back since COVID lockdown. I want to ask a fun question and make sure that they answer this fun question. So the question is, what is the most Canadian thing about you, or what distinctively makes you Canadian? The answer to that question for me is everyone knows I'm Canadian because any chance I get, I point out that someone or something is Canadian. For example, did you know Ryan Reynolds is Canadian? I always say things like that. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Lexi Kaplin first.
Great, thanks so much, Angela. So I'm Lexi Kaplin, co-founder and chief product officer of conversationHEALTH. We really focus on driving conversational AI solutions specifically in life science. So being able to provide precise and accurate answers to patients and healthcare professionals, important questions around disease and product information. We've been around for about 3 years and have grown quite a bit in that time, though headquartered in Toronto, really operating on a global scale. Certainly with our roots being in Canada, though, there's a lot of that's been taken into account with our product development. And the one thing that's most distinctively Canadian about me is definitely the I'm sorry stereotype, to the point where, if you bumped into me, I'd apologize. But one thing that, was a moment of delight when I was first testing one of our bots in market, that I had not been involved in all the minute specifications of what did have a response but didn't have a response. I was trying to break one of our bots and swore at it, and immediately there was this amazing GIF that popped up of Joey from Friends, who was acting all shocked, and then said, "I'm sorry, let me connect you to a human." And so I'm glad that our bots are a little bit Canadian as well.
That's great. That's great. And you say, of course, you say sorry, not sorry like the Americans.
Of course.
Of course. Sheldon?
Yeah, so Sheldon Fernandez, CEO of Darwin AI. We are also about 3 years old. We are based out of the University of Waterloo and organically connected to the university. We are cracking a fundamental problem in artificial intelligence that you'll often read about, known as the black box problem, which is that AI can do all these wonderful things, but we have no idea how it reaches its conclusions. So we have some real IP that our academic team have developed to crack that problem. Look forward to telling you more about that in this session. And Lexi, you stole my thunder because that was also going to be my characterization of what makes me Canadian. I apologize a lot. And the quintessential example of that, a year ago, I was actually at Game 6 when the Raptors beat Golden State. I was there by chance. My son was 6 months old, and when they lost Game 5, we thought, can we actually pull this off and go and leave our son with people? And we did. And after the Raptors won, I found myself apologizing to the Golden State fans for Toronto's victory. And they looked at me and said, wow, the stereotype's true. You Canadians really do apologize even when you don't have to. So there's a shared camaraderie here, definitely.
Sheldon, I'm sorry for taking your answer on that one.
And I'm sorry that you feel and the need to say sorry.
That's wonderful. Thank you for giving me a bit of taste of Canada while I've been away. So before we dig into conversation health and to Darwin, I would just love to take a step back. And, it's not every day that I get to speak to AI experts, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone here, but can you both comment on what AI is and what AI isn't? It'd be great just to understand what your definition for AI might be. Maybe Lexi can go first.
Sure. So, as I'm sure Sheldon will say, AI is used to describe a lot of different technologies. And so fundamentally, if you're thinking about the progressiveness of the technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, neural nets, et cetera, really it's about a program's ability to understand and learn based off of various different constraints. And of course, when you're working in highly regulated industries, you need to place more constraints than less. And that's where it'll be a really interesting conversation to see Sheldon's perspective on it with the black box problem versus how we've solved it at Conversation Health. But having entered the industry right when I think the commercialization of AI really started, we were getting a lot of questions around what exactly is AI? Are we going to build something that's going to take over the world, so to speak? And so this is where, certainly in our world of virtual assistants, chatbots, voice skills and whatnot, there's a lot of button-driven experiences that are just strictly rule-based. That's really not AI. AI is that ability to understand, in our case, natural language processing and natural language understanding, what somebody means when they ask you a question of the millions of ways that they can phrase it. What's the core intent, the purpose of their question, and being able to direct them to the right resource from that.
So I would largely agree. The original definition, I remember looking this up for a panel I was on when the first computer scientists talked about AI, was when a non-sentient entity, so something that's artificial, exhibits behavior that humans would classify as intelligent. And that definition is just rife with ambiguity, because what do humans consider intelligent behavior? And the irony is that we've had to raise the bar of what artificial intelligence is as these systems have gotten more powerful. So it used to be the case where if a machine could play chess as well as a grandmaster, that would be intelligence. And then when Deep Blue beat Kasparov in 1997, we said, well, it doesn't really know it's playing chess. It doesn't understand the context of it. And so, Lexi, I think you hit on something very powerful, which is the ability to learn. Can the machine intuit its own rules apart from humans and apart from what it's programmed to do, and evolve according to things that it sees? And I think second wave AI, when we talk about machine learning and deep learning, kind of characterizes that understanding. And even now you're seeing people challenge that definition. So you see people saying, well, AI is good at registering the world, meaning giving you some quantitative understanding of what's happening in the world, but it's not good at reckoning with the world, which is really understanding context. And as a father of somebody who's 22-month-old son, I see him reckon with the world with disastrous consequences all the time. So that's the fascinating thing about it, is the definition grows as the sophistication grows. But in general, does it learn with new scenarios, and can it respond to that without human intervention?
I love that definition of learning and adapting. It's the first time I've heard about that. Let's go deeper into the companies that you guys are building. Maybe I'll start with Sheldon first. I'll put him on the spot first. Tell us a little bit about Darwin AI. How did you get here? What does the company do? What's the problem you're solving, and why? As I perused the website, I saw this term called explainable AI. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the story of Darwin is interesting. My previous company was being acquired in 2017, and a former colleague said, connect with these academics at the University of Waterloo. They don't know a lot about starting a company, but they're brilliant, and they've created this really interesting IP, and have a conversation with them. And little did I know that would result in another venture, two ventures really, because 4 months after joining Darwin as CEO, my wife got pregnant with our first child, my son right now. But the essential thing that we're doing is, so our academics have been leveraging deep learning, which you'll often hear about, which is a very specific form of machine learning. And it's premised on neural networks that emulate the cognitive capabilities of the human mind. And a lot of the profound capabilities that you will read about with AI, natural language processing, image recognition, are usually a byproduct of deep learning. And they recognized 5 or 6 years ago, before most of us even knew what these terms were, that one of the fundamental challenges of deep learning was a neural network will give you fantastic predictions. It will tell you with 99.9% accuracy that this is in fact a picture of a horse. But the designers of the system, i.e. the humans who put it together, have very little understanding as to how and why it's reached those conclusions. And that is what we call the black box problem or the explainability problem. And the most profound example I can give you, we had an autonomous vehicle client in the early days of Darwin, where the car that they were designing would turn left with increasing statistical frequency when the color of the sky was a certain shade of purple, right? So just pause and think about that. Color of the sky, shade of purple, car turns left. And we know as human beings that in general, the color of the sky should not dictate the way you turn. I mean, maybe there's a volcano or something. So this is what we call a nonsensical correlation, because the car is modeling, or the system's modeling data. And after a lot of debugging, we helped them determine that they had trained the turning scenario for the AI in the Nevada desert when the color of the sky was this shade of purple. And so what this illustrates to you is that AI systems are not giving you reflections about the world, they're reflecting the data that they have been trained on. And as a result, that data will often be biased, it'll have holes. And the real problem is if we don't understand how something is reaching its conclusions, we don't know where it'll fail. And if we don't know where it'll fail, there are all these problems with it. So we have technology that our academics created to crack that problem, essentially.
Right. And so what does a product look like for something like explainable AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now we have explainable AI for designers, for developers, right? So it'll surface for them, hey, when the network made this decision, these were the prominent factors in that decision. When COVID became acute in Canada, we designed a neural network called COVIDNet that diagnoses corona based on chest x-rays. And in the early days of COVIDNet, it wouldn't even look at the lungs to diagnose corona. It would look to see if somebody was lying on a hospital bed, for example. And so this is an example of AI reaching the right decision, but for the wrong reasons. So this is a tool that we have for developer. Now, what we're learning is that that's good, but the next step is to surface it to a non-technical user, a radiologist, a clinician, so they understand. And that is a visual interface that's showing you in context why AI is doing what it's doing.
So you mentioned that explainable AI right now, the product itself is more geared towards designers and developers and engineers. Can you give us a little bit of sense of traction? Have you reached product market fit? Do you have a story about an inflection point in the business?
Yeah, so we made a big announcement in May where we announced a strategic collaboration with Lockheed Martin around explainability. So we're working with them and their designers and developers and doing this in a very technical way. And so to have a company of their stature and size recognize the promise of our IP and so forth was really important. And I'd say that was a good inflection point of validating our tech in the eyes of that vertical. And I would say we've got product market fit with developers and designers, but the real area we need to find it is with the business unit owners who control most of the budget. And so we're working with them now to figure out, like, when you say explainability, what do you need to see to have trust in the system?
That's great. Unlocking even more opportunities to make a little bit more money.
Exactly.
We'll come back to you in a second, but let's switch gears and move over to Lexi and dig into conversation health a little. So same question for you as with Sheldon. Tell us how you got here. What does the company do? What are you solving? Why do we need AI?
Sure. So fundamentally, we believe that a conversation at the right moment, whether with a patient or with a healthcare professional, has the ability to change outcomes. If you saw, back in 2018 or so, there was 1 billion searches on Google every day are related to health, whether that's, side effects known of products, trying to diagnose yourself by, going through all these like symptom checkers and all of that. But fundamentally, if you do the calculations around how many physicians there actually are in the US or globally, there's not enough people to be able to meet this demand. And this is where AI really has that ability to be 24/7 scalable and supplement the reach of our human support system. This has been exaggerated, if anything, through COVID-19 over the last 6 months or so, where 3 years ago, we had originally started as a single chatbot to answer health and wellness questions directly to people on channels they were using every day, like Facebook Messenger at the time. It was through trying to find sponsorship and monetization plan that we had gone to hospital systems, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, trying to see whether they would turn on modules to support their products or to be able to facilitate different streams of activities within this direct consumer bot. We realized that they were lightly interested in sponsoring what we had done at the time. There was no technology that was able to actually create the virtual assistant for their patients, their healthcare professionals, to be able to answer questions about their treatment plans and whatnot. And so this is really where Conversation Health came to play, both from the fear of AI, which Sheldon touched on, which we had to address in how we operated, but even in how and where we apply AI in such a regulated industry where, frankly, any kind of misinformation can also impact healthcare outcomes. And so it's extremely important to have the right answer at the right time when it's being asked. And so this is where we've created the platform to be able to drive various different solutions, from clinical trials all the way to commercialization of a treatment within the healthcare system that is able to help support both patients and healthcare professionals.
Mm-hmm. And both you and Sheldon did touch upon this, but how do you sell AI to regulated markets like healthcare when their concerns can be as irrational as Skynet? So how do you think you can break down that barrier?
So to touch a little bit on where you started of what is AI, it's also important to note that not all AI is the same. We were touching a little bit on deep learning and neural nets, and it's very important that when you go into these conversations in highly regulated environments, more than anything, they want to know and be able to predict what the system is going to do. Because again, if you provide the wrong answer in a scenario, there are severe consequences in the real world associated with that. So as one example, we will never touch natural language generation to be able to combine on the fly what a response should be, because if the system's wrong, then that will impact a patient's treatment plan and whatnot. However, by using very specific kinds of AI, whether that's NLP, NLU, and various different forms of essentially input-oriented AI, so to be able to understand what a user is asking for, you're able to actually send them to approved, reliable resources where in all world, we actually map the world of intents around a particular therapeutic area, so a condition or a product, and behind each of those intents are able to establish a business rule, whether that should be escalated to a human, whether that should be provided a document, an approved response. And with that, actually, we've been able to work directly with those regulatory teams that are sometimes the biggest advocate for what we do, because this way you can ensure that 100% of the time, what the virtual sales rep, what the virtual nurse is saying is accurate and compliant and aligned with, say, the FDA or whatever the local regulatory body accepts.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned, presenting information, the right information at the right time. The word conversation is also in the name of your company. So I'm also curious, outside of just being accurate, which is obviously very important, how much does empathy matter in conversation if you are, say, a bot, especially in healthcare? We always get feedback about bad bedside manner, as an example. So I'm curious how important it is for you to convey empathy and care, and how do you do that?
So it's interesting that you bring up bad bedside manner, because sometimes our humans aren't the most empathetic.
That's true.
Where it's actually really interesting to see how technologies like bots can actually supplement humans and essentially look at optimizing where is the best place to have a conversation, encourage it between, say, a doctor and a patient, versus what would they actually perhaps prefer to have with a technology that's essentially been built with a personality that's designed for that particular use case. So let's say for a patient who's just been diagnosed with a condition, being able to have the empathy to be able to support them across their treatment plan. This is where you can embed that personality into the bot that actually sometimes make a person more comfortable to ask it than to another human. What's also important with that is, as much as we would love to have human-to-human conversations 24/7, and even if that was feasible, the reality of a patient's journey when they are diagnosed with a new condition, they typically hear the first sentence that their healthcare professional, their doctor, would have said to them at that point of diagnosis, and then miss a ton of information after the fact. And so this is where we see that bots are able to supplement that, be able to provide that helpful information after a patient's actually left the physician's office.
That's great. Let's move to more general questions around Canada and AI. Sheldon, a few years ago, Toronto was pretty much hailed the Mecca of AI. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on how the Canadian AI ecosystem looks now compared to the rest of the world. Have we maintained our advantage? What are we great at? Where are the opportunities for us to improve? I always thought back in the day that Canada was a little overhyped, right? But I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether my assessment is right or wrong.
Yeah, a great question. I'm a bit conflicted because I'm a Waterloo grad and also a U of T grad. So there is this friendly competition with Waterloo and Toronto, which I think is healthy. I think where we excel in Canada is with the research, is with the academics, and with the fundamental technology that enables, the commercialization elements we've been talking about. And as evidence to that, look at the number of companies around the world that have set up AI shops in Toronto and Waterloo. There's NVIDIA, there's Samsung, there's LG, there's Google, Microsoft. Where I think we can improve, though, is, Canada often scores well, again, with the R&D phase, with the, fundamental technology phase, but bringing companies to scale and turning it into unicorns that we have in Silicon Valley in Canada, that's a tougher proposition. We have, the Shopify's, and we have a few examples, nowhere as many as our American counterparts. And I think that's the thing that, we really need to look inwards and determine how we can improve. And I think there's real opportunity there. So I think we're on par with a lot of the hotbeds you'll see around the world, and certainly the US and China and Israel. But it's the scaling question that I think Canadians need to ask. And I think certainly initiatives like this are an important part of that.
I'm wondering now, given that we're kind of living in this COVID world, that it'll translate in the post-COVID world, that we can work anywhere remotely, right? And so scaling of talent no longer has geographical limits.
I think absolutely, and I think you're seeing a lot of companies that didn't think about Canada as a possible expansion area contemplating that. And it's almost impossible not to have this conversation without the political overtures, but that's a motivator of companies setting up shop in Canada as well, which I think is great. But we also need to have Canadian startups that leverage that hype and are owned by Canadians and run by Canadians as examples of how to do this.
Right. I'm cognizant of time. I can't believe how quickly it just flies, but I want to, we today have had the benefit of learning so much from the both of you. Part of being a part of the C100 community and 48 hours is that we can offer you help. So I want to give you the floor right now to make an ask of everyone who's tuned in right now. What are some of the challenges that you have, and where do you think the Canadian network here can help?
Lexi, I'll let you go first.
Sure. So, first of all, I have to say I completely agree with everything you said around needing to emphasize the commercialization of AI, not just the R&D, particularly within Canada, as a lot of the times our technology ends up moving south of the border or, to various different geographies. I think that in Canada, we're actually uniquely positioned to have a global frame of reference where some of the largest markets in the world are right in our backyard, but our regulations actually more closely match the rest of the world. This is where at Conversation Health, we're actively scaling and really driving solutions at a global scale across Asia, North America, Europe, Latin America. And so my ask for the C100 team is really in any kind of experience in that globalization of a company, particularly a software company, and being able to hear from your experiences and learn from them. We're also actively working on developing partnerships and other business development opportunities. So if you work within the life science industry and are interested in hearing more, certainly reach out to me either on LinkedIn or through the Slack channel.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Sheldon?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, as mentioned, we've cracked explainability at a very technical level. And now we're aspiring to go beyond that for organizations that are thinking about it as it relates to their business and their vertical. And so we would love to connect with organizations in defense, in healthcare, in financial services that are really starting to ask these questions because we think we have a unique offering. And so I would love to connect with any organizations in your network or orbit that can help us with that.
Got it. So Lexi around globalization, Sheldon around more explainability beyond designers and developers. So if you guys can help, please reach out to them directly. Thank you so much for spending time with me today and with Lexi and Sheldon. And we hope to see you soon.